we're 20 million in the hole for this FY under a continuing resolution. But the spirit of ATF is to do whatever we can to always protect the public and serve the public.
Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, because I know your commitment. I was a local mayor. We did joint task force with the ATF. I'm really been impressed with your agents and their commitment. But I cannot tell you how many people from your agency, this is the word they would most often use, is that your agency is starved for resources, and you could be doing a much better job in keeping guns out of the hands of criminals. Local communities like mine, I live in the inner city of Newark, New Jersey. We see guns pouring into our communities, and we have found that a significant number of them are coming from a very small group of retailers that sell to criminals or to straw purchasers. You're aware of that, right?
Yes, sir.
And in fact, the data is that we know the research shows that 1% of licensed dealers supply a whopping 57% of the guns that are recovered in crimes. You're aware of that, correct?
Yes, Senator. That's a study I think that's over 20 years old. I would not agree with that statistic today. Okay,
but you know that it's probably, do you agree that it's a small amount of retailers that are often providing illegal guns into sourcing illegal guns? It's a small group. It's not the majority of retailers, but there are certain groups that are, certain retailers that are more prone to give straw purchases and illegal purchases, yes?
Yes, Senator, most of the federal firearms licensees are very hardworking, law-abiding citizens. At ATF, we developed 6 years ago a business model called Frontline. It's intelligence-led, risk-based. So we look at all data to see who would be like your troubled dealers,
right,
and we put them as a priority. I established a top 100 list on FFLs to be inspected throughout the country every year. And so it feeds to what you're saying, is like focus on the businesses that are not compliant with federal law, allegedly, and that we will target them for systematic inspections. And if the allegation is credible, we'll go after them with criminal investigations.
And with more resources, you could be doing more.
Yeah, I can't sit up here and lie to whether you're Democrat, Republican. Yeah, sure. ATF, we could do more, and a lot of the police chiefs. And to your experience as mayors, I get hit up all the time saying, hey, just give me 5 more ATF agents here. Chicago, when I launched 20 I got calls from police chiefs.
I want to underline that, highlight it, that it's very frustrating to those folks who are trying to prevent crime in communities like mine with gun violence, where overwhelmingly, when I was mayor, we tried to look at it, only one person committed a shooting with illegally purchased guns, that we have tons of these illegal weapons pouring into our communities. Another frustration is the TR amendment. You're familiar with how local law enforcement all over this country can't understand that we can't get common sense trace data to find out where these guns are coming to try to shut off the spigot. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator. And to be fair and balanced, I guess, would be the word, that there are some dealers that could be maligned by data when they're complying with all the federal laws, but just by where their business is, and they could be doing everything correctly. And I know of instances of these inspections on paper. It would take someone like yourself going, hey, Tom Brandon's gun shop had it's responsible for 1,000 guns that trace back there, and I could be doing everything correctly, and it just could be the volume that I'm doing.
Sir, but we have issues of due process. But the problem, what we're seeing is just getting basic common sense, pragmatic data is very important to solving a problem. Sure. We have agencies that have been hamstrung on their ability to get common sense data. This is not a partisan issue. You don't need to be fair and balanced. People who are trying to keep guns out of the hands of folks who are trying to do ill, they need data, they need research, they need access to information, and we're not seeing that.
No, Senator, and I feel your pain, because I've never met a person in favor of gun violence. And I will share this with you. The departments are getting the data through an individual trace. I recommend that they establish their own database. They track all that, and you would have all the data you're looking for. But we have to comply with the federal law, and that's what we do.
And the point I guess I'm trying to make in conclusion is that we, as the folks who should be trying to keep safe, should enable you with federal laws that allow you to do your job. And local police forces in small communities in my state don't have the resources to create the kind of databases at least New York City is able to do but we can't keep these guns off our streets because we can't get basic information so law enforcement can do their job. And I appreciate you, sir. And again, your agency is incredible. Such great officers, very brave men and women.
Senator, thank you for saying that because, and like I said previously, they're on the street right now serving warrants with our federal, state, and local law enforcement partners, putting their life at their line. I notified something last night, but thank you. That means hearing that from you all helps more for morale for ATF agents in the field, and so I sincerely thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Harris.
Thank you. I also want to recognize not only the hard work of the men and women of each of your agencies, but the students who are out there right now protesting. They are mourning the loss of their classmates and frankly, of their innocence to some extent, knowing that they have to be prepared for what might be a massacre in their own schools. But they are also protesting our inaction, the inaction of Congress, in the United States Congress. And whether it's Sandy Hook or Sutherland Springs or the Stoneman Douglas High School, what I think all of these young people, these leaders, are making very clear is it's a false choice to suggest you are either in favor of the Second Amendment or you want to take everyone's guns away. And right now what we need is we need to have common sense gun safety laws in our country. And frankly, to get to that place, I would suggest that I don't know what we're waiting for. We don't need any more tragedies. We've seen some of the most tragic incidents that one could imagine. And we don't need any new ideas. We've got great ideas. What we need is we need the United States Congress to have the courage to act. And so, you know, having said that, I'm troubled by a suggestion that has come from the administration that one solution might be that we arm teachers. And I just want to really understand what that might mean. Let's break it down. So as a career prosecutor, I have worked with many communities where children go to sleep each night hearing gunfire. And so what we're proposing is that those children, remember Sandy Hook, we're talking about 6- and 7-year-olds. So children are supposed to go to school and look at the front of their class at their second-grade teacher, and she's going to be strapped with a gun. I don't understand how that makes any sense. Let's also talk about it in the context of the studies that have been conducted by the National Criminal Justice Resource Center, which is funded by the United States Department of Justice, which tells us that for trained law enforcement officials, they only hit of their intended target approximately 20% of the time. So in an armed confrontation, they only hit their intended target approximately 20% of the time. Now we're talking about giving teachers some limited training on how to use a gun. I would suggest that their numbers aren't going to be any better than that. And when we say we miss our intended target, we are necessarily also saying that there may be people that we hit that we did not intend to hit. And if we're talking about a teacher in a classroom, that could very well be the other students. So we have to, I would suggest, be a bit smarter about what we really intend to be the focus of legislation and policy. And Director Bowdich, I would love your thoughts on that in terms of what that would result in if we're talking about limited training of teachers to be strapped with a gun, and what might be your concern about unintended consequences of a policy of that nature.
Well, ma'am, I've spent I share the outrage at these attacks, first off. And as a career law enforcement officer, both at the local and the federal level, I'm not a legislator. Yeah. And I believe that is the legislator's job.
Just as a practical matter, what are your thoughts? Just as a practical matter.
I, like everyone else in the room, have personal thoughts on things, but I'm not here representing me. I'm here representing the FBI. My thoughts are this is a matter for the legislators to take up and decide what is the best solution.
Okay, I would suggest that your thoughts would be very relevant to the decisions we make, but we can have that conversation another time. I also have a concern when we talk about this of the impact of of having armed teachers as it relates to African American and Hispanic students. And here's why I say that. There is an overwhelming body of evidence that shows that harsh disciplinary protocols disproportionately impact children of color. We know that in the studies that talk about what the rates are in terms of suspensions and expulsions from school. The FBI has done an extraordinary job, I think, of recognizing implicit bias among all professions, including law enforcement, and I would suggest that it applies to all professions. Do you have any concern about a policy that would result in arming teachers, and the concern that we should make sure that if something like that were to occur, that there would be training around implicit bias?
Senator, it's a good question. I never really put the two together, but I have not seen the document that you're referencing. I think whatever we decide, training is necessary on all fronts. The implicit bias training that we in the FBI administered, I believe it was 2 years ago, is actually very important for the organization as a whole, both internally but also from the optics of the external as well.
No, and you've been a leader. The FBI has been a leader on recognizing we all carry implicit bias, and it's important that we are aware of it when we make decisions, especially exercise judgment that might result in harm or even death to another person. And so I applaud your leadership in that regard. My time is up. Thank you.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for your work. I want to especially Mr. Bowdich, if you could pass it on to the director. We were so pleased that there was people were today arrested and charged in the bombing of the mosque in the Twin Cities, and that was a really horrific crime for the community, and we want to thank the FBI for your work.
Thank you, Senator. If I could very quickly, there was also a tip that came in from our ATF partners that helped in the solution of that case. It was a joint investigation.
Thank you. It was a really big deal in our community. Thank you to both agencies for your work on that. So I come from a big hunting state, Minnesota, and I always look at these proposals in front of us and say, would this hurt my Uncle Dick in his deer stand? And I don't think universal background checks would hurt. I don't think the proposals we're talking about with assault weapons would hurt. And so I think I'd start with that. I went to the meeting with the president, and he looked right at me, and I don't expect you guys to say this, and said that he favored universal background checks, that he wanted that Manchin-Toomey bill done, and also that he wanted to do something on assault weapons. And that just hasn't happened so far. And so if you feel frustration here, you hear it even more when you're out there with the students, where I was just 10 minutes ago. And I was encouraged that he talked about the age limit, and we've seen businesses, including Dick's Sporting Goods and Walmart, raising the age limits for purchases at their stores. And so just to be clear, under current law, if an 18-year-old passes a background check at a licensed firearms dealership, like the killer did in Florida, and buys multiple military-style weapons, would the FBI have a record of the sale? Mr. Bowdich.
Sorry, rookie mistake, Senator. If he purchased the weapons legally at 18 years old, we have a record. Yes, we do. Yes, ma'am.
So you have a record, and is there that goes right into your system? Like
now that said, when there is a proceed, when people call in for a proceed and they receive a proceed to purchase that firearm or to sell that firearm rather, we have to get rid of that information within 24 hours by federal law.
So it doesn't stay in the system?
Yes, ma'am.
So that's a problem.
No, that's okay.
That's the law.
Could that be a problem?
It's
but
the
that's
law.
a law. So we
Yes,
could
ma'am.
change the law. So it would stay in the system. You don't have to give your own personal view on it. We could change the law. Is
Yes,
that
ma'am.
right? All right. Well, I think we should. One area where we should be able to find common ground is taking action to protect women who are at risk of violence from domestic abusers. When I was at the White House, I gave the president the figure that 6,000 women died at the hands of their partners with guns, and that is more than the number of brave troops that we lost in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the background check bill would help a lot in domestic abuse cases. We've seen that in other states. But the other thing would be the bill that I have to extend protections to include dating partners and to prevent those convicted of stalking misdemeanors from buying guns. A number of police organizations have supported this. Can you talk about the connection between gun violence and domestic abuse? Anyone up there?
Yes, ma'am. First of all, I share your concerns about the scourge of domestic violence. As far as the correlation, I don't have the studies or the data to back it. Certainly, anytime you have the emotions that occur in some of those incidents, anytime there is a firearm in the mix, it can get 10 times worse very quickly.
Okay. I want to turn to a 2016 report by the GAO, which found that the FBI took longer to deny a firearm purchase because of a misdemeanor domestic violence conviction than for any other prohibited category. The report found that only about 70% of NICS checks involving prohibiting domestic violence misdemeanors between 2006 and 2015 were denied within 3 days. That's disturbing, since gun sales are allowed to go forward after 3 business days if a check is incomplete. Could you talk about why this might have happened with these longer processing times?
Senator, I've not seen that document you have referenced. I would like to take that back to get you a better answer. I don't know the answer right on the face.
I'd appreciate that, because what it means is that roughly up to 30% of these gun purchases could have been allowed to go forward during this time, even though these people could have been convicted of domestic violence misdemeanors. And the report, the GAO report, which is an official report, found that this led to up to as many as 6,700 firearms being transferred to people who should have been prohibited from owning a gun because of a domestic violence conviction. So those are pretty astounding numbers, and I ask you to look into it and to get back to me.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Bowdich, the gaps and misjudgments that you've described clearly did not provide the FBI its finest hour. But I do want to say that I think the clarity and candor of your recognition and acceptance of responsibility here and the quick response by Director Wray have been admirable, and I hope are some solace to people who've had concerns about what exactly transpired. We look forward to your report. What I would like to specifically request of you is a clearer exposition of the data cloud that comes in through your PAL line and through other sources that must be reconciled into investigative judgments. Senator Durbin referenced the $4,100 calls per day figure. You said that there's a certain amount of automatic sorting that takes place for frequent flyers who you've perhaps checked off as not being credible, so that sorts itself down. I don't have very many minutes with you here, but if there is some sort of a diagram that we could look at that shows what the background blizzard of information looks like, out of which you're expected to make determinations as to which data point is telling as to the prospect of a future crime, it would be helpful, I think, for us to see that. Do you have such a thing, and could you provide it?
I don't know that we have it, but I can find it and provide it. Yes, sir.
Great, thank you.
The other thing I would offer, Senator, to you and anyone else on this committee is we are more than happy to actually walk you through the call center at any point. If I could very quickly, this center was built in January of 2012, and it was built because we were trying to save the field work, so we were trying to centralize and standardize the tips and leads that came in and then went out. They have evolved that center, doing a good job. It's not perfect, obviously, and we made a serious mistake here. However, one of the things we have recently done to better develop that word cloud is we brought in the operator's side from both the Criminal Investigative Division and the Counterterrorism Division to have them look at the words and determine, with the emerging trends and threats, do they currently have the right words associated with that cloud?
I'd like to raise with you all a slightly different topic. One of the voices that has been most impressive and harrowing to me has been the voices of the trauma teams who've had to deal with the effects of the high-velocity ammunition that an AR-15 propels. I think it's still a little fresh to be reading through those details, particularly given some of the affected individuals who are here in the room, but I would like to ask unanimous consent that several articles, like What I Saw Treating the Victims from Parkland, should change the debate on guns. Wounds from a military-style rifle is a ghastly thing to see in the New York Times. After the Las Vegas shooting massacre, survival can be excruciating from the Washington Post. And Parkland, AR-15 injuries harder to treat than handgun wounds. I'd like to ask those articles to be made a matter of record in this proceeding, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. It does seem that the ammunition involved played a significant role in the casualty count in a lot of these recent shootings. I'm wondering first, Mrs. Althari, in your work, Dr. Althari, excuse me, in your work, do you take into account instrumentalities in evaluating risk, or are you looking more for high-risk actors?
In terms of the research that we've done, multiple variety of weapons were used. Firearms were the most common, but we've also had knives, explosives, vehicles. Obviously, that's kind of been in the news lately.
Does the category of ammunition that an AR-15 launches create a different level of safety risk than regular handgun ammunition in your estimation?
I cannot comment on that because that is not something that we came across in our research specifically.
Would you take a look at that question and see if your research would support an answer to that question?
I can look into that, sir, and see.
I would appreciate that. And to Mr. Bowdich and Mr. Brandon, any observations with respect to the added trauma, harm, and fatality from that specific type of ammunition compared to regular handgun ammunition?
Well, Senator, thank you for the question. Like I mentioned, I was a young person in the Marines, and I was trained on then the M16A1. The training I received was specifically as the lethality of that you could have a small projectile with traveling at a high rate of speed, causing major damage. And I do know from reading similar reports that yourselves and also the handgun ammunition traveling at much less. I think the .223 round goes about 3,300 feet per second.
Yep.
And so the article you referenced was just picture a boat going through the water, and there's all separation, that the projectile doesn't have to hit the tissue to do damage. And if it hits a certain organ, say like the liver, you know, you won't survive it. And whereas handgun ammunition, I've showed up on scenes, guys shot in the leg, you know, and waiting for EMTs. And I've also seen people shot with .223 rounds or 7.62 AK rounds, and they were screaming.
It's a qualitatively different injury.
Yeah, and again, this is science.
Yes. Thank you. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Okay. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Feinstein, and my thanks to all the witnesses, to Mr. Brandon, Mr. Bowdich, Dr. Alathari, and to other federal law enforcement agencies and entities, DEA, marshals. My hometown of Wilmington, Delaware, has suffered through an epidemic of gun violence, and we are grateful for the assistance we've gotten from federal law enforcement as we try and work federal, state, local to really tackle gun violence in my hometown. I'm also grateful to witnesses that will join us here on the third panel, Catherine Posada and Ryan Petty from Parkland, Florida, and to the young people, the teachers, the faculty, the students all over the country who are raising their voices even now. I've heard that high schools all up and down my state, middle schools, elementary schools, have walked out this morning to demand action by all of us in Congress. From Claymont Elementary School to P.S. DuPont Middle School to Concord High School, from Caesar Rodney to Dover, Middletown to Newark, Salesianum to St. Mark's, we have dozens and dozens of schools across my small state where students are walking out to get our attention. They're asking the adults to be the adults and to solve this problem. So I'm grateful for their work, but I'm gravely concerned that we don't seem to be able to come together on proposals that have a reasonable chance of being enacted here. In February alone, 5 individuals under 21 were shot in my hometown, and these are not the subject of national exposés or great focus either in the New York Times or on ABC News. And it's just a reminder that in small cities and large cities and rural communities and in urban communities across our country, week in and week out, gun violence takes lives. Gun violence makes our nation one of the most violent, one of the most lethal on earth, and there are things we can do together to address it. I was grateful that Senator Toomey of Pennsylvania, my neighboring state, joined with me to introduce 2 weeks ago a modest bipartisan proposal to better enforce existing laws. It's called the NICS Denial Act. It simply says that when someone who is a person prohibited goes in to a federally licensed firearm dealer and lies on their form, tries to buy a gun, and are denied that opportunity, that should be reported to state and local law enforcement so they can take appropriate action. Mr. Brandon or Mr. Bowdich, can I just start by asking, it is a crime to try and buy a firearm if you're a person prohibited, if you're a convicted felon, adjudicated mentally ill, convicted of domestic violence. That's a crime, isn't it?
Senator, yes, it is. We refer to it as lie and try.
Mr. Bowdich.
Yes, sir, it is. And the Attorney General just came out with guidance where he is directing more efforts towards lie and buy efforts.
And if someone goes in and tries legally to buy a gun that they are denied the chance to get, isn't that a great predictor that they're about to go try and get a gun another way, whether through a straw purchaser, through theft, through some other illegal means?
Senator, in my experience, yes. Often we come across cases where if the person's denied, and typically it's a younger female, and offered some money that may be significant to that person who may be in a difficult situation and lies on the form and it's transferred over. I routinely get reports of us making arrests in those situations.
So there were 120,000 cases in 2016 of folks who were prohibited, who went in, who tried, who lied and tried. That would seem to me to be an important priority. I'm pleased to hear that Attorney General Sessions is raising the profile of that. There were fewer than 32 cases even considered for federal prosecution, and I think we ought to be providing greater resources to state and local law enforcement, to federal law enforcement, and pass this bill. It is a simple bipartisan bill. Let me ask a last question, if I might, Mr. Brandon. Requests by the FBI to recover an unlawful firearm are particularly dangerous because they require an ATF agent to confront a prohibited person who's now known to be armed. Would you agree with me that in cases where there's a NICS failure or where someone who lies and tries and then goes and secures a firearm another way, these are particularly dangerous for ATF agents?
Yes, sir. You never know what you're up against.
Well, I'll just say this in conclusion. It seems to me that the voices of students from across my state, from Parkland, and from all over our country are asking us to find responsible ways to work together. Virtually every one of my colleagues who I've been with today have introduced bills that would tackle this problem from a wide range of areas. This strikes me as one of a dozen, whether it's banning bump stocks, whether it's limiting magazines, or whether it's making sure that the NICS system and background checks are made universal and effective. We should be doing this in the interests of our communities, our families, and our children. Thank you.
We have finished our questioning of your panel, so you folks are free to go now, and I'll call the second panel. And while the second panel is coming, I will introduce you. Ryan Petty is the father of 4 children, including Elena Petty, who lost her life at 14 years of age in that attack at the high school in Parkland. Since the tragic shooting, Mr. Petty has engaged with lawmakers in Florida and here in Washington, D.C. to pursue meaningful reforms that will keep our children safe and our schools secure. Mr. Petty's son, Patrick, is also in attendance today. Catherine Posada is a 10th grade teacher at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School.